in Drisha's building on the Upper West Side on 65th Street. It was a general medical ethics lunch and learn, but I thought, oh, I'll just spend a class or two talking about the issue of determination of death. 6 classes later, we were still deep into the topic. And my interest and exploration of this topic have only deepened since then. The issue of determination of death is critical when we think about organ donation, for the very simple reason that there are certain organs that cannot be donated by a live donor. Obviously, heart, lungs, other vital organs that a person cannot voluntarily donate during one's life. Or organ donation from posthumous organ donation, or as it's usually referred to as cadaveric organ donation from a cadaver, also increases the availability of organs beyond those who would voluntarily donate. We'll be talking about voluntary organ donation, live organ donation on Wednesday in the panel discussion that I'll be participating in, since I am a recent kidney donor. But the bottom line is that without posthumous or cadaveric organ donation, there will be many, many fewer organs of all kinds, including those that can be donated from a live donor, available to those who need them. And therefore, this is a critical issue when we think about organ donation in general. And we think about the history of organ donation as a medically viable procedure. It is really tied up very closely with the issue of determination of death, which was a medical issue in the 1960s and 70s, especially. And when various issues with organ donation were resolved in the 1980s, with the widespread availability of anti-rejection drugs that affected simultaneously both live organ donation and cadaveric organ donation. There's a lot to talk about when we think about the determination of death, and especially as it relates to the issue of organ donation. Indeed, when we think about the issue more broadly, as we'll be doing on Wednesday in the last class in the series, we'll have to talk about the extent to which those two issues were really inexorably tied to one another. In other words, did doctors and scientists and bioethicists push the envelope in terms of how they defined death in order to make more organs available? Okay, that's an important historical question. It's also an important ethical and moral question, because of course, when we think about determination of death, the kind of red line there is not committing murder. And there's a general assumption, it should be obvious, but maybe one could quibble and say that there's a cardinal rule called the dead donor rule, that one should never harvest organs, and that's the technical term, harvesting organs from a patient unless they have been determined to be dead. Right? You could have said otherwise. You could have said, if this patient is will never recover from a coma, maybe we should be able to harvest their organs. Why not save somebody else's life if this person's life is effectively over? And yet there's a generally agreed upon principle, an ethical principle in the medical community of the dead donor rule, which is you should not harvest organs from anyone who has not been determined to be dead. The question then is, what is the determination of death? And this is something that was a medical issue that evolved gradually over the course of the 20th century, and truth be told, is still evolving, given that our understanding of the process of death continues to be enriched with additional research. Again, something that we'll talk about on Wednesday. From a Jewish perspective also, there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot of history to talk about, given that this particular issue of organ donation is not the first time that there's been Halakhic controversy about how to determine death. I've taught this course in many different configurations with many different kind of time spans, ranging from a one-off session where we have an hour or an hour and 15 minutes to talk about the various issues, to a 5 or 6 session class where we really have time to unpack all of the history and all of the various texts around this topic. We're going to do something in the middle with a 3-session course. We're not going to be exploring some of the early modern texts that relate to determination of death and the controversies that arose in the early 18th century and then again in the 19th century about determination of death. What we're going to be doing in today's session is exploring the early rabbinic sources, those in the traditional Halakhic corpus, the Mishnah, the Talmud, and the medieval commentaries. Tomorrow's session will be dedicated to the responsa of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. We'll talk about why Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who was one of the leading halachic authorities of the 20th century, is so pivotal to this issue in particular. And finally, on Wednesday, we'll be talking about how the Jewish and halachic perspective on this issue fits into the broader bioethical debate about brain death, and in fact, what halakha can contribute to the broader debate about this issue in the bioethical community. I think there are certain elements of the way that brain death has been analyzed in halakha, and particularly by Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, that can be enlightening for a broader understanding of the bioethical issues as they exist in discourse nowadays. Okay. If you want to follow along in the source sheets that have been sent out, by all means do so. I'll be sharing my screen, and I have a second screen here, which is why I'll be looking off to the side. So you can feel free to follow along there as well. When organ donation became a viable medical reality, which is to say, at the first time that doctors really considered the possibility of harvesting organs from a dead donor, halachic authorities started to explore what this meant in halachic terms. And what's fascinating about this topic in particular is the way that it hits so many pressure points, so to speak, in terms of the nature of halakha, the process of halachic adjudication, the relationship between science and halakha, and the way that halakha develops an approach to what is really a significantly new halachic issue. The basic issue came about or rose to the fore really only after the first successful human-to-human heart transplant, which was performed in 1967 in Cape Town, South Africa. Dr. Christian Barnard and his team harvested a heart from a young woman who had been severely injured in a car accident. The woman's name was Denise Starfall. They determined her to be dead based on certain criteria that we'll talk about. They harvested her heart and implanted it in the recipient, whose name was Louis Washkansky, a Jewish man who had a fairly severe heart disease. And he survived for 19 days. The heart functioned. That's the benchmark for saying that it was a successful human-to-human heart transplant. Unfortunately, he died due to other complications only about 2.5 weeks later. The issue of anti-rejection drugs was obviously became a pressing issue during this time, and eventually, after about 2 years, led to an almost complete moratorium on the further performance of human-to-human organ transplants for most of the 1970s, with very few exceptions. Medical centers around the world did not do this. But a few of the early transplants were successful, including one, as we'll see, the second heart recipient in South Africa survived with his transplanted heart for over 1.5 years. Even though there were no anti-rejection drugs, his body did not reject the heart the way that Louis Washkansky's did. when this happened, doctors were suddenly forced to address the moral issue, or I guess we can call it. I don't want to distinguish for the moment between what could be a moral issue and a bioethical issue. The basic question of how you determine death and how you determine this is not, in fact, murder. There were two separate groups that met in 1968, both of whom agreed to accept what became the standard of brain death, death as determined by neurological criteria. And we're going to talk about what that means over the course of the next 3 sessions. Very briefly, what that means is that if we determine that the brain is no longer functioning on a basic level, is no longer sustaining basic bodily functions, based on those criteria, we can determine that the patient is in fact dead and harvest their organs. Why is that important? Why is it important to define death in a new way? Why not just define death the way that we'd always defined it? Because what doctors discovered as they experimented with human-to-human organ transplants from cadaveric donors is that as soon as somebody was determined to, as soon as someone died, their organs began to deteriorate very, very quickly. Even within a matter of minutes, organs that were harvested from a dead donor were not viable. They had already degraded to the point where they were not viable when transplanted in the recipients. And therefore, it became critical, doctors realized, to harvest organs at the point where the patient's heart was still beating. That became the standard for when when organs needed to be harvested. Why was it important that the patient's heart was still beating? Because what sustains organs, what sustains the tissue, is blood flow. And therefore, doctors said we need to define death, and we need to figure out if we can call the patient dead at a point where the patient's heart is still beating. One would assume that heartbeat is in fact a dispositive sign of life. The doctor said we can define life in a way that relies on neurological criteria, and therefore at the point where we see the brain is no longer functioning, then we see that the patient is we can declare the patient is no longer alive and permit harvesting the patient's organs. That was the basic premise of the standards of death that were kind of widely accepted by the medical community in 1968. What would halakha have to say about this issue, about determining that a patient whose heart is still beating could be considered dead based on other neurological criteria? The halakha didn't actually have to say anything about that explicitly, and therefore halakhic authorities were forced to go back to the sources and think, what are the sources that relate to this question? One of the very early articles that was published about this pointed to an unusual source. And here you see something about the nature of halakhic thinking, the way the different issues are tied together, so that sometimes the most relevant source to a particular topic really comes out of left field. Here was the Mishnah that this article pointed to. The Mishnah on Ohalot. Ohalot is a masechet, is a tractate that deals with issues of corpse impurity, of tum'at meit, which is an issue really only for kohanim, for those who are for priests who are commanded not to become impure. And of course during the period of the temple when impurity had other ramifications, including not having not coming into contact with sources of tumah in the context where somebody might be eating purified food or consecrated food, kodesh food, such as sacrifices or truma or maaser, priestly tithes. So the Mishnah on Ohalot talks about the standard of death and basically says that there's a bright line distinction between life and death. Don't assume that death is a process. There is an exact point at which a person is considered dead, and it's only after that point that the body is considered, that the corpse is considered to be a source of tum'ah. Here's the text. A person does not convey ritual impurity until his life departs, even if his arteries are severed or he is on the verge of death. Okay, again, somebody can be close to death. One can, again, a visceral reaction to somebody who's in the throes of death one could relate him as if he's already dead, as if there's some impurity there. And therefore, the Mishnah says, no, somebody who is still clearly alive is not a source of tum'ah. And so too, cattle or wild animals don't convey ritual impurity until their lives depart. Here, the issue is not corpse impurity. Here, the issue is a different kind of impurity that's conveyed by animals, animal corpses. But again, the same standard applies. They're not considered to be tameh until the animal has actually died. If they were decapitated, even if they're still convulsing, they convey ritual impurity. So here's an interesting point. What can we say is a determining sign of death? The Mishnah says decapitation. Decapitation is clearly a sign that the animal is dead. Seems fairly obvious. Why is it not obvious? Even after decapitation, the body can still be convulsing. There can still be rigor mortis. And therefore, the Mishnah has to say decapitation is in fact a sign of death. What is not a dispositive sign of life? Movement. The fact that the body is still moving, even if it's moving in a lifelike fashion, that does not indicate that the body, that this animal carcass is alive. Why? What's the basis for saying this? The Mishnah says as follows: for they are like the severed tail of a lizard which continues to convulse. Why does it mention this example? It's an analogy where we see movement in something that is clearly not alive. Nobody's going to say that the severed tail of a lizard is still alive, but if you cut off the tail of a lizard, sometimes it will still convulse. And therefore, the Mishnah uses that as an example where movement is clearly not a sign of life. What does this Mishnah tell us? How is this Mishnah valuable for this discussion? It may seem obvious again that decapitation is a clear standard of death. Okay, but then you ask yourself, well, wait a minute, what does decapitation mean? If the head is completely severed from the body, that's obviously decapitation. But if that is partially severed from the body, at what point do we say something counts as decapitation? I know this can develop into a fairly grotesque discussion. But this is the kind of thing the Talmud gets into. What is decapitation? And in fact, in this case, the Talmud does discuss what happens if the neck is only partially severed. Well, parts of the neck need to be severed in order for the animal to be considered decapitated. The discussion that this was woven into addressed some of those topics and then said as follows: what if we know that the head is still attached, but that it is neurologically no longer functioning relative to the body? In other words, functionally, the brain has been severed because there's no more neurological connection, no functional connection between the brain and the body. Could we say that's considered death? Maybe that's considered to be a standard of decapitation and fits into the context of this Mishnah. The proposal then was that based on this Mishnah, one could make a halachic argument for neurological definition of death. That a neurological definition of death, the lack of brain function, would effectively mean the person is considered dead because they are functionally decapitated. That was the argument that was made. I believe the article was published in 1959, one of the very early discussions of this topic. Again, I think it was even before the broader medical discussion of brain death, and we'll discuss why in later classes why this became an issue even in the 1950s, even before it became practical. I'd be happy to if people have I want to pause here and maybe take some comments in terms of, or questions in terms of why what people make of this source and its relevance to this topic.
And if you're an attendee and you want to ask, message me or use the raise hand function and I will unmute you.
Okay. I'm not seeing any comments in the chat column, and nobody's raising their hand here. Think about this because it's an interesting source. What makes it especially interesting is it's really the only source that exists in the only mainstream, the only prominent source that really discusses the head as a something that could be used in determining life versus death. it may seem surprising to us that given how prominently how the prominent place that we think of as the brain serves in terms of the overall functioning of the body, but in fact the brain is almost never referred to in any similar context in Halakhic literature. This is the only source that really could be used to make an argument for the head, and obviously the brain, the brain as well, as being something that is critical for a determination of the boundary between life and death. Okay, um, you see this occasionally when halachic authorities are discussing a new issue, and suddenly they pull a source out of left field. The issue here has nothing to do with medical care at all. Certainly nothing to do with any kind of any kind of potential use of the body. It's really only about tum'ah and the question of whether this body is alive or dead, and therefore whether or not it conveys tum'ah. And yet that issue maps directly onto the question of whether they're alive or dead for medical purposes, and therefore it's potentially useful. It's potentially a useful source. The truth is that we're going to leave this source aside. We will come back to it next week, or sorry, we'll come back to it tomorrow in tomorrow's session, because even though it was proposed early on as a potential source, there really was not a lot of developed halachic material around this, and therefore it would have to be very widely accepted, and very fairly quickly in order for it to become the dominant source, and that didn't actually happen. There are other sources, which we're about to examine, that address the issue of determination of death from an entirely different angle, and are much more mainstream in terms of the way that death has been traditionally determined in Judaism. Eventually, we'll cycle back to this Mishnah and talk about why it might be relevant, and where it enters into where it actually entered into the halakhic discussion in a way that made it a useful source. But for now, we're going to leave it aside. The only other source that really discusses the issue of, or I should say, the only source that really discusses the question of life versus death in a practical medical sense, raising the question of how we know for sure that someone is dead, is a Mishnah in Smachot. Smachot is one of the minor tractates that deals with issues of mourning. Smachot is a euphemism for avelut, for mourning, and talks about therefore various aspects of end of life care as well as mourning. And this source, towards the end of the tractate, discusses the following practice and some curious stories as well. We go out to the cemetery and examine the dead within 3 days, and do not fear being suspected of superstitious practices, literally the ways of the Amorites. Okay, here's a question: can you go out to the cemetery and check that somebody is actually dead after they have been buried? Okay, a little context here: how were people buried in the period of the Mishnah and the Talmud? Typically, at least in the land of Israel, they were buried not in the ground as we do, but they were interred in a cave or a crypt. Okay, the body was interred there. It decomposed over the course of a year or so. Then, at the end of that period, the family would go and gather the bones, which were all that had not decomposed, and then either bury the bones or put them in a special ossuary, a special box that was used to store the bones of the deceased. And therefore you could go and check to see if somebody was in fact still dead. Was that something that people should do? Maybe that was kind of superstitious and therefore should be prohibited. It's something that Jews don't do. That's something that the idolaters do, the Amorites do, and therefore something that we should practice. And the answer is no, that's okay. Why is it okay? Because it has a practical benefit. It's not simply superstitious. It has nothing to do with metaphysical or mystical concerns. It's really just practical. How do we know it's practical? Here's the following story. It happened once that a man was buried, was examined, and found to be living, and he lived for 25 years and then died. Another so examined lived and fathered 5 children and then died. So here we have apocryphal stories of people who were in fact assumed to be dead, and then because of this practice, found that they were in fact alive and rescued from their from the cave or the crypt, and continued to live for an extended period of time. We see here then that the issue of determination of death was not necessarily a straightforward matter. There is some concern that we might make a mistake. And this is going to be a concern that hovers over this entire topic, because, of course, even nowadays, there are times that somebody is diagnosed as brain dead and then suddenly wakes up and we realize that an error has been made. Okay, and we'll talk about those as well. Not today, not maybe a little bit tomorrow, but certainly on Wednesday as well. This source is also going to be a background source that we're going to put aside for now and come back to later on. The main discussion of how to determine death comes up in yet another unusual context, one where there is a need to rescue survivors, or potential survivors of an earthquake or building collapse on Shabbat or Yom Tov. And this comes up in the end of the Masechet Yoma, in the following scenario. If a building collapsed on a person and is uncertain whether he is there or not, or uncertain whether he is alive or dead, or uncertain whether he is a heathen or a Jew, we must clear the heap for him. If there's a building collapse on Shabbat or an earthquake on Shabbat, and we think that somebody might be buried underneath the rubble, we go ahead and clear the rubble. Why is that a controversial issue? Why does the Mishnah need to tell us that? Because clearing the rubble certainly involved various kinds of malacha, prohibited activity, activity that would normally be prohibited on Shabbat or Yom Tov. Why is it permitted? Because the basic principle behind this Mishnah is Safek pikuach nefesh doche Shabbat. Even a concern that there might be somebody whose life is in danger warrants violating Shabbat, requires us, in fact, to violate Shabbat in order to save them. And this is the basis for an enormous amount of things that are done in any medical setting nowadays, in any emergency services setting, in any military setting, anything that might put in danger someone's life warrants violating Shabbat, and in fact, if it's and requires violating Shabbat if the danger is clear. And therefore, here, where we think there might be somebody buried under the rubble, or even we think they might be alive, and we think they might be Jewish, do we not save non-Jews' lives on Shabbat? Technically, no. In terms of the halakha in the books, no, but on a practical level, yes, we do. Okay, so this is an interesting halakha, which we're not going to get into. The halakha in the books is that if we know somebody is not Jewish, then we don't violate Shabbat in order to save them. But practically speaking, this halakha is not practiced, and therefore, for example, when there was an earthquake in Haiti in 2010. The Israeli Medical Service, Zaka, which is involved in a number of emergency services, including and mainly in Israel in recovering bodies and parts of bodies after terrorist attacks or other fatal incidents. The Zaka went to Haiti and participated in the emergency rescue, even though all of the victims were certainly not Jewish. When Shabbat came, they continued to do exactly what they had doing before Shabbat, because we save all human life on Shabbat. All human life warrants violating Shabbat. Even though there are so many levels of doubt, even though there are so many levels of sfekot in this case, none of them lessen the mandate to violate Shabbat in order to save a human life. Okay, that's a cardinal principle that's most clearly established in this Mishnah. What do we do then if we find somebody? Well, we need to determine whether they're alive or dead, because the only thing that allows us to continue violating Shabbat in order to save somebody's life is the fact that they're still alive. If we come across a victim and the victim is clearly dead, then even though we want to rescue the body, we have to stop. Rescuing the body will have to wait until after Shabbat. Recovering a body is not something that allows us to violate Shabbat because it's not about saving a life. So as soon as they find somebody, if he is found alive, we continue clearing, but if he is found dead, we leave him. Again, very difficult thing to process. We would have to leave a body there until after Shabbat, even in circumstances where the body might be desecrated over Shabbat by the elements, by animals. We do our best to protect the body, but we're not allowed to continue clearing the heap in order to recover the body. That's the Mishnah. Raises an important question, of course. How do we know whether somebody is alive or dead when we uncover the victim? So here the Gemara gets into a fairly detailed discussion. We're not going to go through the whole discussion in the Gemara, but we're going to get to the basic point, which is as follows. Our sages taught, how far must one examine? Here we are, removing the rubble in order to uncover the body. How much of the body do we uncover in order to determine whether the person is alive? Until his nose, we uncover the body until we see part of the face. And there are those who say until his heart, ad libo, that you continue uncovering until you get to the heart. That is the debate in the Gemara. There are two opinions. And that's the main focus of the discussion in Halakhic sources as to how you determine death, right? Because if you have to uncover it only until the nose, then clearly you do some procedure at the nose to determine whether somebody's alive. According to the opinion that says you do it until the heart, clearly examining the nose is not enough, and you have to do something else. So what we're going to do in the time remaining is examine these two opinions and figure out what they have to say about the issue of determining death in halakha. When you look at these sources, what do they say to you? It's a little hard to do this without audience feedback. So for those who are here, feel free to jump in.
Just want to highlight a comment from the chat from Ellen Hertzmark. There's an assumption that you start from the head end. This is not obvious.
Excellent. The Gemara eventually gets to that. Okay, I say when I'm teaching Gemara, if the Gemara doesn't say something and you have a question, write it down, and 80% of the time the Gemara will get to the question that you had. That's exactly where the Gemara is going to go in a couple of minutes. And of course, when you come across the body, you might not even know where the head is, but the assumption seems to be that you can identify what part of the body you're uncovering. And for the moment, let's assume that you're uncovering the body from the head down, even though, as Ellen correctly said, that's not necessarily the case. What would this say if we're talking about the nose versus the heart? According to the opinion that says the nose, it's fairly clear that the standard, that the criteria that we use to diagnose death is breathing, right? That's what you determine at the nose. Classically, by the way, in most ancient cultures, most pre-modern cultures, really up until the modern era, the way the death was determined is by sticking a feather, a piece of glass, a mirror under the nose, and seeing if the feather moved, if there was condensation on the glass or the mirror. That was typically what was done. Okay, why the nose as opposed to the mouth? The nose is the most sensitive place to determine whether somebody is still breathing. According to the one who says you examine until the heart, what would we assume? You might assume that we're looking for cardiac activity, heart activity. Let's pause here for a second, because most halakhic authorities who read this think, here we have a debate that seems awfully similar to the debate that goes on nowadays. When doctors said in the late 60s that we can use neurological criteria to determine death, what's one of the neurological functions of the brain vis-a-vis the body? To regulate respiration. And therefore, when we talk about brain death, and we'll talk about this much more next week, when we talk about brain death, cessation of respiration is a critical criterion in determining the diagnosis of, in diagnosing brain death. If the patient is still able to breathe, then we assume that the brain is still functioning on a basic level, that the brain stem, at least, is still functioning because the brain stem is what regulates breathing, is what induces the person to breathe. And therefore, the assumption is that the person is not neurologically considered to be dead. Can the heart still be beating? Well, technically, yes. The heart is not dependent on the brain in order to function. The heart is the only self-regulating muscle in the body, I believe. The heart what induces the heart to beat is the internal internal mechanisms in the heart, and therefore technically the heart can still be beating even after the person is no longer able to breathe. Eventually, of course, the heart will stop beating. Why will the heart stop beating? The heart is deprived of oxygen, like any other muscle in the body. Eventually, it will stop. But the heart can continue to breathe sometimes, and the heart can continue to beat even if the person cannot actually breathe. When we think about the determination of death based on neurological criteria, we're already ramping things up a level, because typically what happens nowadays, when a person is determined to be neurologically dead, they're almost always on a respirator. They're connected to a respirator, which artificially pumps oxygen into the body. We'll discuss the mechanisms of respiration more I keep saying next week, but it's tomorrow. A respirator pumps oxygen into the body artificially. It breathes for the patient. And therefore, even at the point where the patient is no longer able to breathe, because the brain is no longer stimulating the lungs to inflate and deflate, the body is still supplied with oxygen, and therefore the heart will continue to beat. And this is what happened, in fact, and one of the issues that came up in the 1950s and 60s, and why doctors had already started to consider a neurological definition of death even before the issue of organ donation, which is the patients who were being artificially respirated eventually got to the point where it seemed that the brain was no longer functioning, and yet their body was still sustained. Why was their body being sustained? Because they were being artificially supplied with oxygen, and their heart continued to beat. Their heart continued to beat, and that sustained the rest of the muscles in the body, but the brain would degrade sometimes to the point where it would be a state what doctors called respirator brain, which is the brain tissue essentially completely liquefied or almost completely liquefied, and therefore was clearly no longer functioning. If you accept a neurological determination of death, then you say heartbeat is irrelevant. What we care about is the functioning of the brain, and especially one of the key criteria in determining brain function is the person's ability to breathe. That could be seen as the position of the opinion that says you check until the nose, because what do we care about in determining death? We care about the person's ability to breathe. If they're no longer breathing, then they can be considered dead. According to the other position, what might you say? That you check until his heart, because until the heart stops beating, then the person is still considered alive. And that would be the position of those who nowadays say you cannot rely on brain death, that as long as the patient's heart is still beating, for whatever reason, whatever the other issues are, whatever the other things that are happening to them are, if the patient's heart is still beating, then they're still considered to be alive. In other words, you could see this Talmudic debate about whether you check until the nose or until the heart as being roughly parallel to the contemporary debate about whether brain death is an acceptable standard of death and determined, among other things, or diagnosed, among other things, by an inability to breathe. And those who say that no, heart function is a dispositive sign of life, and as long as the heart is functioning, the person's still alive. It's so tempting, in fact, to see this debate as parallel to the contemporary debate. Virtually everybody who writes about this particular Talmudic passage says, oh, you see here a parallel to the contemporary debate. And therefore, unless we accept the position that you check only until the nose and don't check until the heart, we can't accept brain death as a halachically acceptable standard of death.
Just want to
So
highlight
far, so good.
from
Questions
Zan.
on this? I want to make sure this point is clear, so if you have questions, please feel
Yep,
free.
from Zan, Aladef, heart could also be breathing. They wouldn't check the heartbeat that way.
You guys are way ahead of me. Yes. So when you read this sugya, and it's very tempting to read the sugya this way, and then you stop and think, is that the only way to read it? No, it's not. In fact, when you're learning Gemara, it's good to stop and check your first impulse, because usually there's another way of thinking about the sugya. And in fact, this way, I would agree with Zan that this is not necessarily the best way to interpret this debate. When the Gemara says ad libo, what does it mean? Well, libo could mean the heart, in which case you could say you're interested in cardiac activity. But if you stop and think about it, you have a number of questions. First of all, they know about cardiac activity in the did they know? Can you check cardiac activity by checking the chest? Medical technicians know that this is actually not the best place to check if a person's heart is beating. There's just too much muscle and tissue and other stuff between your skin and your heart to feel if the heart is beating faintly. If you put your hand here, you can feel it, but that might be because you can feel your own pulse. What's a better place to check if a heart is beating? We check a pulse on the wrist, on the neck, on the ankle, diaphragm. There are many better places to check if the heart is beating. Did they know about pulse in the ancient world? Did they use that as a standard? Is there a reason they would say check the chest and not someplace else? They did, in fact, use pulse as a vital sign in the ancient world. We know this not from Halakhic sources, but from other ancient sources. Egyptian medical texts, for example, from the Greek period, say that, yes, they didn't use pulse as a vital sign. Did they connect to heart function? Not our problem for right now, but at least that was another possible option the Gemara seems not to refer to. Well, wait a second. If they're talking about the chest, and this is not the best place to check heart function, well, what could it mean? And here you have a number of questions. First of all, do you have to say that libo means the heart? That's a linguistic question that could be analyzed if we looked at other instances of the word lave in rabbinic literature. Well, I give you a couple here. For example, if you look at the Gemara in Brachot, talks about what part of the body you have to cover when you pray. Okay, people didn't necessarily have a lot of clothes. They were washing their clothes and they wanted to daven. They might have just thrown something on that wouldn't necessarily have covered their whole body. The Talmud says as follows: when his garment is made of cloth, of leather, of sackcloth, it was strapped around his waist, he is permitted to recite the Shema. Again, this is talking about a man and not a woman because they covered his private parts. But for prayer, for the Amidah, as opposed to the Shema, one may not recite it until he has covered his chest. That's how I'm translating et libo. Why do I say that he's covered his chest and not his heart? Because your heart is already covered. We're not talking about the heart organ here. Libo is a metonym for chest, the chest area. We look at the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, we see it again. Again, I don't want to get into the technical issues of capital punishment, to say nothing of the jurisprudential or moral issues of capital punishment. But here's how one of the techniques of capital punishment was described: the process of skila. Skila is literally stoning, but the way that a person would have been stoned if they were put to death by this means is as follows. The stoning platform from which the condemned man is pushed to his death is twice the height of an ordinary person. One of the witnesses pushes him down by the hips. If he turned over al libo, on his chest, okay, you don't fall on your heart, you fall on your chest. It's the front of your body. He turns him over onto his hips, i.e. onto his back. In other words, it's clear here that the Mishnah uses other body parts to refer to front and back. Front is libo, which functionally means the chest. Matnav, which literally means hips, also means on the back. Okay, so again, we see that libo does not actually refer to the heart organ, it refers to the chest. Okay, and again, in the Mishnah and Eruvin, how you measure the Shabbat limit, how do you measure the 2,000 amot? 2,000 amot is a pretty long distance to measure. So it says one may measure the Shabbat limit only with a rope of 50 cubits long. Two people would go out and they would stretch the rope 50, 50, 50, no more and no less. Why wouldn't you want to use a longer rope? Because there's too much slack on the rope. Shorter rope introduces too much room for error. And one may measure the limit only at chest height, keneged libo. Again, libo seems to me the chest. In fact, if you look through rabbinic sources that use the term lave to refer to a physical part of the a part of the physical body, sometimes lave refers to a state of mind, right? Kivein libo, it refers to intention. But when it's referring to a physical part of the body, it's always used to refer to the chest rather than the heart. Why does it use that? Don't we have a word for chest in Hebrew? In modern Hebrew, what's the word for chest? Chazeh. Chazeh is never used in rabbinic Hebrew, as far as I could find, to refer to a part of the human body. It's only used to refer to the part of an animal's body. And therefore, the word libo always means chest. Well, now that we've cleared that linguistic hurdle, what could we go back and say? Ad libo means that you uncover them to the chest, which now raises the question, what are you looking for at the chest? Says Zan in the comments, libo could mean, if it means chest, you could be looking for the heartbeat, but we already said that wasn't so, it's not so practical. What else can you see at the chest? The rise and fall of the chest during respiration. And therefore, what would we say based on this debate? There's two signs of respiration. Do we check until the nose and see if there's airflow at the nose, or do we have to continue checking to make sure that there's also no rise and fall of the chest? That could be seen as the debate. If so, both of these opinions consider respiration to be the critical sign of life and the absence of respiration to be the critical sign, a way of determining death. That seems to be the simplest interpretation of the Gemara. To drive that point home even further, what do we see in the continuation of well, 2 points. First of all, we see in the continuation of the Gemara as follows. Rav Papa states the debate only concerns only a case where the victim is uncovered from the feet up. Rav Papa actually changes the orientation and the context completely. He says, really, the debate is only if you're uncovering them from the feet up. And then the question is, can you stop at the chest, or do you have to examine even the nose? What Rav Papa is basically saying is, everybody agrees that it's respiration. And the question is the chest a sufficiently sensitive place to sense respiration, or do you have to continue to the nose? But where he's uncovered from the head down, all admit that once you have examined the nose, you don't need to examine any further. Okay? That's Rav Papa's position. That's his reading of this debate. The very fact that everybody agrees when you're uncovering from the head down that you can stop at the nose clearly indicates that there is not a more fundamental debate here about what physical criteria you're using to diagnose death. Clearly, everybody is talking about respiration, and clearly everybody assumes that as soon as you determine the patient is definitely not breathing, they're considered to be dead, and we stop trying to save them on Shabbat. That's one position. We'll come back to Rav Papa in a minute. The other interesting point is, when I gave you this Gemara, I gave you it as printed in the standard Vilna Shas and most printings of the Talmud. In fact, the only Rishon, the only medieval commentary who reads the Talmud this way, who has this text until the heart, ad libo, is Rashi. Rashi is, of course, the most prominent commentator on the Talmud. He wrote the running commentary that we still use today, that's printed in all contemporary editions of the Talmud. It's very unusual for Rashi to be the odd man out on an issue this prominent, but in fact, he is. All other Rishonim, with one slight exception, who cites both variants, all other Rishonim have the following text. Okay, this is from Rabbi Yitzhak Alfasi of Spain and North Africa, a contemporary of Rashi's. His text of the Talmud reads as follows. Our sages taught how far one must examine until his navel. And there are those who say until his nose. In other words, heart doesn't feature as an option here at all. It's either the nose or the navel. What are you checking for at the navel? Clearly, you're checking to see if there's movement of the diaphragm in breathing. It's the only way to read this. And therefore, since that's the only text that most of the medieval commentaries have, it's clear that for most of them, the issue is almost certain is respiration. There's really no other option. Okay, so far so good. Questions, comments on this?
And again, I can very easily unmute you, ask in chat, this raise hand function. We want to hear your thoughts.
Maybe.
This might be jumping ahead or jumping the gun here, but it strikes me that all of the arguments that we're sort of dancing around for neurological criteria rely on extrapolation, right? That it doesn't seem necessarily nor necessary to me that we would extrapolate from respiratory to neurological. And the same thing with the Mishnah from Ohalim, that it doesn't seem necessary to me that we would extrapolate from, if you cut off the tail, right, that already the Gemara or the Mishnah is extrapolating from the lizard case there. And I'm not sure that we would then extrapolate from a cut off head, a physically cut off head to a I don't know, a neurologically cut off brain.
Okay. Look, anytime we're doing this kind of analysis, we're making analogies, and it's almost necessary in this case that any kind of analogy is going to be a bit of a stretch. Okay, we will certainly continue to talk about this as we go forward, and we'll continue to talk about it a little even today. Why again, the Mishnah in Ahalot is maybe the furthest stretch in terms of comparing a case of actual physical decapitation to virtual or functional decapitation. But when we get to these sources, we're really talking about the nuts and bolts of medical diagnosis, and it's not so much an analogy between what they're talking about and contemporary brain death. It's saying, is respiration a sufficiently decisive criterion to say that the person is no longer alive? Right? That's essentially what the issue is. Because without the respiratory criteria, we can't talk about brain death at all, or so it would seem. Right? If a person is breathing independently, we have to assume that their brain is still functioning, or again, so it would seem. Yeah? Is that, do you understand the difference between the Mishnah and Allah, which really an analogy, which requires us to kind of to compare two things that maybe you could say are not really comparable, versus this case where it's really talking about a specific criterion that's necessary even nowadays for the diagnosis of death. Did that make sense?
Yeah, it tracks.
Okay. Okay. Okay, one more point in the Talmud. How do we know that respiration should be the sign of life? Why is that the determining criterion? Rav Papa adds one more point. Why, he says, when you're covering the body from the head down, you can stop at the nose. Why is that? He quotes a pasuk, "For it is written, all that has the breath of life in its nostrils." Okay, that's a pasuk that's quoted in the intervening discussion, which we're not going to get into. Pasuk from Bereshit Perek Zayin, Genesis chapter 7. What's the context there? Where does that pasuk appear? In the context of the flood, when it's talking about all living creatures, aside from those in the ark, who died. It said, all that has the breath of life in its nostrils died. Okay, and therefore we use the breath of the nostrils specifically as an indication of death. It's interesting that it quotes this pasuk as opposed to other pasukim that also talk about the nose and breathing at the nose. For example, it doesn't quote the pasuk in Bereshit Perek Bet in Genesis chapter 2, where it says, "Vayipach be'apav nishmat chayim," that God breathed the breath of life into the nostrils of Adam, right? It could have quoted that one, because presumably we're more interested in determining death rather than life. But this phrase, this turn of phrase, the breath of one's nostrils, nishmat ruach chayim be'apav, becomes an enormously powerful phrase within Halakhic literature. And I think we'll see later on within broader, at least Western culture and maybe human culture in general. Okay, the notion of breathing as a dispositive sign of life and then maybe a definitive sign of life. Okay, so this passage from the Talmud is enormously important and features in virtually all discussions of this topic from a halachic perspective. Where is there still a bit of complication here? Oh, and how do we rule, by the way? Which opinion do we rule like? If you look, for example, at the Shulchan Aruch, which is the definitive or the most widely accepted code at the end of the Middle Ages, he says, even if they found him, a person crushed, somebody got uncovered under the rubble, such that he couldn't live more than a short time. Let's say somebody who we uncover from the rubble is at death's door. There's no way they're going to survive. We uncover him and examine up to his nose. Okay, there's an imperative to save someone, to do what you can to save someone, even if you know they're going to die in the short term. Any amount that you can extend their life, you violate Shabbat in order to do so. We uncover him and examine up to their nose. If they don't, sorry, there's a typo here. If they don't detect life in his nose, then he is certainly dead. Okay, so again, he points to respiration at the nose as the definitive sign of life. And there's no distinction between whether they uncovered his head first or his feet first. You always have to check at the nose, again, because that's assumed to be the definitive sign of life based on the pasuk, and possibly because that's the most sensitive place in the body to see whether there's respiration. So that's how we rule, and that is basically the accepted opinion throughout most of Jewish history, and really only becomes problematic on a practical level, or raises questions on a practical level in the 19th century, when there's some controversy that we'll maybe refer to tomorrow, but not going to get into right now. Where's their complication? Well, first of all, Rashi, who is the source of the text that we uncovered, still brings up the heart as a potential issue. And we're going to talk about this more in the context of Moshe Feinstein's response tomorrow. But let's at least read the text now. Okay, Rashi says as follows. Okay, this is how the text should read. There are various other variants in the text, but this is the one that Rashi has, not concerning our issue of heart versus navel, but just about something else. Rav Papa states, the debate concerns only a case where the victim is uncovered from the feet up. So Rashi explains as follows. And they examine him gradually as they approach the head. One opinion states they should examine the heart area to see if there is life therein, since his neshama beats there. And the other opinion states one must examine up to his nose, since sometimes life isn't discernible in his heart, but is discernible in his nose. According to Rashi, again, we're dealing with a case where they're uncovering the victim from the feet up, and as they're approaching the head, do they stop here, or do they go here? Says Rashi, the opinion that says they can stop here, they can see if there is life therein, since his neshama beats there. What does that mean? His neshama beats there. I've deliberately left this term untranslated because this particular phrase, this combination of terms, as far as I've been able to term, does not appear anywhere else in rabbinic or medieval halachic literature. Nishmato dofeket sham. What could that mean? It could be referring, nishama is again a very amorphous term. It can mean breath, especially if we see it as related to the word neshima, which means respiration, or neshama could mean life force or soul, in which case it's not necessarily referring to any particular physical phenomenon. Then we have the word dofeket, which means beats. It's clearly talking about something rhythmic. It could be the heartbeat, or it could be the rhythmic rise and fall of the chest during respiration. It's really not clear what Rashi is referring to. When I show this source to native Hebrew speakers, they say, oh, obviously Rashi is talking about heart function. Why? In modern Hebrew, the term dofek means pulse, and therefore modern Hebrew speakers automatically associate dofeket with dofek and assume it's talking about heart function. Maybe, maybe not. In other words, what you see here in Rashi is the danger of relying on these sources for medical phenomena because of the way that language shifts over time, as we saw with libo. Nowadays, we use libo to refer to the heart organ, and yet we saw in Rabbinic Hebrew, at least, biblical Hebrew may be different, but in Rabbinic Hebrew, at least, it refers clearly to the whole chest area and not specifically to the heart organ. What's Rashi referring to here? And for that matter, how is Rashi conceiving of the relationship between the different parts of your body, right? Did Rashi think of respiration and heart function as being two separate things? We've talked about respiration versus heart function all through this discussion. Is that really an accurate way to think about the way that they thought about the body in the time of the Talmud or in Rashi's time? This would require a much more intensive analysis of Rashi's discussion of medical issues and physiological structures that come up in other contexts, in other places in the Talmud, which we obviously don't have time for. But I want to turn to two contemporary sources. Well, let's start with let's see if we can get through two contemporary sources that examine this passage in the Talmud and raise pretty fundamental questions when we're using pre-modern sources to talk about modern medical issues. Okay. First one is a passage by Rabbi Natan Slifkin, who's a very interesting figure and a very prominent participant in the Halakhic debate over brain death. We'll discuss. I don't know if we're going to discuss some of his other writings on this. This one was an interesting piece that I chose because he raises a particular point that I actually want to critique. Rabbi Slifkin is enormously erudite and has really contributed very significantly to all sorts of discussion of all sorts of issues that come up in halakha and in traditional halachic literature, traditional Jewish literature, for all sorts of things that concern scientific matters. He also is the founder and director of the Museum of Biblical Natural History in Ramat Beit Shemesh, which is a wonderful place to visit if you Beit Shemesh, which is a wonderful place to visit if you're on vacation in Israel. Rabbi Slifkin writes as follows: Now, for a while it's been known that even if respiration has ceased, it's often possible to restart it versus cardiopulmonary respiration, CPR, resuscitation, rather, CPR. It is therefore commonly assumed that the Gemara was not referring to a person whose breathing had merely stopped, but rather to a person whose breathing has irreversibly stopped. Of course, Chazal, the sages, did not know about CPR, but it is claimed their words did not rule it out. Like, there's another issue that we didn't think about. The person's not breathing, right? Well, does that mean they're not breathing permanently or they're not breathing at the moment, right? Can we restart their breathing? You can do CPR. What else can you do to restart somebody's breathing? Mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, right? Gemara doesn't raise that possibility. If they're not breathing, it's assumed that they're dead. Yeah? Why? On Friday night, he writes this in a blog. I realized this is not true. Furthermore, I realized that everyone is very clearly overruling Chazal in this. Why? Because in order to do CPR, you need access to a person's chest, which means that you are clearing more rubble away. But the Gemara is clearly unambiguous, and if there is no respiration at the nostrils, it is forbidden to clear away any more rubble. The Gemara forbids clearing away any more rubble, and yet every single posek would say this is mandatory. Nowadays, what would we do? If we found somebody not breathing, we would try to resuscitate them. We would do CPR, we would put them on a ventilator, we would do something. This case arguably shows the poskim today, even those who rely on respiratory death, are not following Chazal's exegesis. Chazal understood the pasuk to mean, the verse to mean, the respiration equals life and lack of respiration equals death. But these poskim, contemporary halachic authorities, are understanding the pasuk to mean that permanent lack of respiration means death. Stop and think about this for a second. Are we misinterpreting the Gemara? Nowadays, we would say that you have to do anything you can to resuscitate them. And yet the Gemara just said, if they're not breathing, they're dead. Does that mean we're overruling the Gemara? What do you think, folks? Yeah, Kayla's response says it all. Maybe. I haven't thought about that. Yeah, interesting. Well, here's a question. If Chazal knew, if the sages knew what we know, would they have ruled differently? So Rabbi Slifkin says, yes. Now, of course, you can say that if Chazal would have known that pushing the chest can restart respiration, they would have interpreted the pasuk differently, and certainly the world would have ruled differently. Once you're going down that path, and you have to wonder what Chazal would have said differently had they understood the role of the brain and lived in a world where brain-dead people can have their hearts and lungs maintained in operation for a while. Likewise, you have to wonder what we should infer from Chazal's words in light of their not having known these facts and not having lived in such a world. Once you're thinking about what the sages know or didn't know, what access to information they didn't have, what technology they didn't have access to, you can in fact start to wonder whether these sources are really relevant at all, because we live in a very different world with very different technological means and very different understanding of the body. Maybe what they're saying doesn't tell us very much about medical reality nowadays at all. You could say this, okay? This is a very potent argument and one that we will talk about more as we go forward. But I want to push back on this and say, yes, you could say all of that. The question is, should you say all of that? And I'm not sure that you should. When we think about what Chazal are saying, what the sages are saying, that cessation of respiration is determination of death, it's true. They don't distinguish between permanent and temporary cessation of respiration. Why not? Because for them, all cessation of respiration was for all intents and purposes permanent. They had no means of restarting somebody who was not getting somebody to breathe when they were not actually breathing. What about mouth-to-mouth resuscitation? Couldn't they do that? No. Mouth-to-mouth resuscitation was a technique that was invented only in the 18th century, and therefore was simply not available at this time. It wasn't even something they could have considered. Even so, what they've said is respiration is a critical sign for life and death. And therefore, it's true that what they're talking about is not necessarily reflected in our contemporary medical reality, or not entirely reflected. That doesn't mean that it's not relevant at all. We have to reinterpret what they're saying. We have to insert the distinction between permanent and temporary into what they're saying, but that doesn't mean that there's no meaning and no relevance for the fact that they point to respiration as a critical sign of life or death. In fact, you're always doing this. Anytime you rule from a precedent or even a very broad principle to a new set of circumstances, you're making certain interpretive assumptions. There's no way around this. I would further suggest that even though Rabbi Slifkin's right, that nowadays we would do our best to get the person to breathe again by whatever means we have available, the fact of the matter is often we don't have those means available, right? We don't always have a ventilator or respirator available. We don't always have the means to do CPR, and CPR is often not effective. We don't always have the means to do mouth-to-mouth or mouth-to-nose resuscitation. And therefore, often we're in a situation where it is exactly like Chazal are describing, namely, if we determine that they're not breathing, then we say, okay, they must be dead. In other words, medical reality nowadays is not always that different than what Chazal are describing, especially in these kinds of emergency settings where we don't always have access to top-notch medical care. So I want to raise Rabbi Slifkin's argument because it's something that will come up with raise a couple more times. The question of, is something that Chazal are talking about relevant if it's not exactly what we're talking about? And the answer is maybe not, but let's suggest that it's more relevant than one might think. Rabbi Edward Reifman is another very important figure in terms of discussions of medical halakha in many different areas. And he raises a different point here that I just want to touch on in the few minutes that we have left. He says as follows. When we think about the way that the body was conceived of and the relationship between heart function and cardiac function in the ancient world, we have to understand they thought about the body completely differently, and especially heart function. Let's just read what he says here. The theory of the innate body heat was first suggested by early Greek writers. The innate heat became the single most powerful, important motive power in the animal system. The source of this innate heat was the heart. Okay, what do they think the heart did? It provided innate heat to the body. Why do they think the body provided heat? Well, think, for example, about somebody with a fever, right, where they get much redder and they have much their blood, right? When we think about the theory of the humors, they seem to have too much blood. Why? Because and they have a fever, they get hot. So the heart is beating too hard or beating too much and causing them to be hot. Okay, one can think about the diagnosis of very medical activities, medical conditions, and it doesn't seem so illogical. The primary function of respiration, according to the Greeks, was to cool and conserve the innate heat of the heart. Why did you need to breathe? Breathing cool air into the body cooled the heart. It was felt that this heat must be refrigerated by respiration and kept under control if life is to persist, right? Somebody with a fever often can't breathe deeply enough, which is maybe why they're so hot. The basic principle of life, according to Galen, was a spirit or a pneuma drawn from the air into the body through the act of breathing. The idea of pneumas or spirits probably originated earlier, but the theory underwent significant alteration by Galen. The nondescript air travels to the heart where it meets the innate heat. So the cool air comes into the body, meets the heat of the heart, cools it, and in the process, it becomes the vital spirit and serves to cool the innate heat. That's what air meant according to the Greeks. It was according to Galen, one of the most prominent Greek physicians. Air was drawn into the body, the heart transforms it into the pneuma, which is the life force of the body. Without getting too much into the specifics, what do we see here? Galen and Greek medicine in general did not consider respiration and heart function to be two different things. They were all part of the same system. And therefore, are we really correct in talking about breathing versus heart function? Maybe they were part of the same thing. A proper understanding of Rashi hinges on the interpretation of the phrase nishmato defeket. And again, we discussed why this is an ambiguous phrase. Okay? It follows, here Rabbi Reifman writes, Dr. Reifman writes, no relation, by the way, Reichman, not Reifman. It follows the heart as a respiratory organ, and that Rashi ascribed the notion that the inspired air ultimately reached the heart, ideas widely held throughout antiquity to the Middle Ages. So he says, it doesn't really matter whether we think Rashi is talking about the rise and fall of the chest or the beating of the heart. For Rashi, was all the same thing. So here, too, I think Rabbi Reifman is an interesting point, and we'll talk about this more tomorrow when we talk about Moshe Feinstein's response on this topic. But again, I think we have to be very careful here in terms of whether his reading of Rashi is correct. He says when Rashi talks about the heart, he's still talking about respiration. I'm not sure that's true. I think when we realize that Rashi doesn't distinguish between them, what that means is that we have to treat Rashi's words very carefully and understand that we're doing a process of interpretation when we read him. Not that we can decisively say that Rashi is referring to one thing or the other. So the bottom line is, for Rashi, everything is part of the same system. Okay, we'll pick up with this point tomorrow when we talk about Moshe Feinstein's approach to this issue. Moshe Feinstein will also relate to the interrelationship between the three parts of the body that we've been talking about: brain function, heart function, and respiration. But what we realize from Rabbi Reichman's comments here is that we have to be very careful when we think about the distinction that we're making between brain heart function and heart function, and realize that we read in ancient or pre-modern sources, we're necessarily interpreting them in a way that was not necessarily true to the way that the authors themselves would have thought about it. Okay, so we will pause here and pick up with this with Moshe Feinstein's Chuvot tomorrow.
All right, just one last question I want to highlight from chat before we end. A comment from Zain Aladef. It also makes me think of the biblical meaning of nefesh being through, which is also the connection between the head and the torso.
Nefesh is an enormously complicated term, which sometimes is synonymous with neshama and sometimes not. In fact, the term nefesh is the subject of a book-length analysis by Professor Richard Steiner, who uses it in talking about the question of whether in biblical times they believed in the separability of the soul from the body, and his answer is yes, based on his analysis of how nefesh is used. But yes, nefesh can return to many things, including the throat, which of course is obviously seen to be critical in terms of maintaining life.
Okay, thank you very much, Rabbi Reifman, for this careful and fascinating introduction to your series. Looking forward to it tomorrow, and welcoming everybody back, or inviting everybody back, excuse me, to join us tomorrow and the day thereafter, Wednesday, for the rest of the series. So thank you very much, and to be continued.
Thank you. See everybody tomorrow.